Today, we're doing something a little bit different. Instead of focusing on financial capital, we'll be focusing on one aspect of human capital in China. I'm here with Carrie Wang, a current management PhD student at UCI. She's focusing on the work experiences of Chinese sea turtles. What exactly are Chinese sea turtles, Carrie?
Well, first of all, thanks, Vish, for inviting me and discuss a bit about my current research project. So, the Chinese sea turtle phrase came about as a fancy pun on the Chinese for sea turtles, 海归. So, it's a homophone for the phrase that means to return from abroad. So, now everyone uses sea turtles to refer to the group of Chinese people who have returned to China after studying or working overseas. So my study focuses on the experiences of these sea turtles since coming back to China and focusing especially on the founders and CEOs of these startups that were established since their homecoming. So this study right now is exploratory, and I mainly conduct interviews with those who went back to China to really get a sense of their day-to-day from the ground up. And it's been very enlightening, and I'm learning so much.
Got it. What are the different types of sea turtles?
So this will be a very long explanation, actually. And it's very interesting that you're asking that, right? Back then, when I was first developing my research idea, it wasn't on my radar that there could be different waves or different generations of sea turtles. But I gradually got that sense when talking to my informants. And recently, even all the popular media is picking up on these differences as well. So overall, there's two different major waves of sea turtle. The first wave includes those who have left China since the late 1980s, early 90s, when the Cultural Revolution in China ended and China has established the open door policies with the rest of the world. So back then, only elite students, the exceedingly smart and motivated people, they gained entry into China's few STEM programs. And then after graduating from these programs, they would then leave China to continue in higher educations overseas and obtain graduate and master's degrees. And then after graduating, they would usually stay overseas and work their way up to managerial roles and senior positions in the world's top firms. So, and in the meantime, they would also establish roots and start a family overseas as well. So these are the people that I am focusing on for my studies. And then up until recently, 海归 had a very positive connotation, this phrase. And then this all changed when the second wave of sea turtles is introduced. And the second wave that people talk about are much younger in age and includes what we would consider millennials. So in China, culturally, to get into a top university, it's very difficult. The students have to do extremely well on a national standardized test. And then to circumvent this problem of the students who did not get a really good score, their families would then opt for overseas university. And then, as we all know, Western universities, um, if in these Western universities, international students will pay very high fees, right? In contrast to the local admittees. So in China, it's not uncommon for families to pool their savings together and send someone to abroad to study because one of the Western universities will take their money. So these students, they tend to go abroad for undergrad and master's studies and then returning to China to find a job without much work experience abroad. So the sad truth is that some of them aren't actually capable of finding a job abroad and coming back home, they have to compete with the students who did do well on the standardized test and got into a Chinese university. And also these students who have stayed in China, they have since then in their college cultivated their social network in China. And then networking in China and having the right guanxi and connections is a very important and significant role in achieving the desired outcomes, such as landing a job. So, unfortunately, for those who came back, it is now just as hard finding a job. So, the trend that we are seeing now is that increasingly those who are Korean oriented and ambitious, those who do want to make a difference in China will actually stay in China for their education. And then lastly, I hope you find this interesting. There's actually a further distinction of sea turtles that warranted their own labels, seaweeds and seagulls. So some of the returning Chinese who are considered seaweeds or haidai is because they're having trouble finding work in China. So they 待在家里 or they stay at home. And then there's another way, which is another play on the homophones. And then another group, probably more opportunistic in nature, they will actually fly between China and abroad. And usually this means that they have to leave their family abroad because education usually is considered better in the US while they're working in China. And then they are what's called seagulls.
Got it. That's really fascinating. So, just so I understand, more recently, it's actually a little more difficult for sea turtles to find jobs than those that got into university in China. Got into these top universities in China. Is that correct?
Yes, and this is usually the younger generation, like the people who were born in the late 90s, early 2000s. It's also because China has been putting more resources into the tertiary higher education that getting a degree in China versus getting a degree abroad is actually considered rather equal at this point. And what the older generation of the sea turtles bring in is not just their degree, but their working experience, especially in a global setting.
Understood. Understood. What are some of the motivations for these sea turtles to return to China?
Okay, so it's almost impossible to come up with grand theories about why they did what they did, right? So opportunities certainly played a role, but personal circumstances, conditions abroad, and the relative costs and benefits of staying abroad versus going back to China also played an equally important role. So personal incentives include wanting to take care of their aging parents back in China and actually be with them physically after being away for so long, right? And again, to emphasize, I am looking at the older generation of sea turtles. So now they're in their late 50s, early 60s, some even in their 70s. So and then some of my informants, they talk about hitting a bamboo ceiling in their firms abroad, right? They made it to the senior positions, but to be VPs, to even sit on that executive board, they feel like they didn't have any chance compared to their American or European counterparts. So at some point, they do feel stagnant. They do feel like it's not um, uh, intellectually challenging for them to stay at their current position. And then lastly, personal incentives. Some of them also talked about a desire to give back to the country and the people that allowed them to go abroad in the first place. So China was behind in terms of its economy and innovations compared to its Western counterparts, mainly because of the mass exodus of the brains left leaving China back in the late 80s. And then especially in the biosciences, pharma, medical, and medical devices fields, which are the fields I'm studying, there's a huge, huge gap, intellectual gap. But then in turn, that is also a huge opportunity in terms of market share, right? So those who do see and understand the opportunities are more likely to go back to China, start their own companies, and seize the market share. So from a macroeconomics view, entrepreneurship has always been a critical force in the economic development of many countries. And China understands that. And they're actively developing its entrepreneurial culture. So many STEM industries, such as IT, and in my study, pharma and biomedical industries, they're starting to take root because of the encouragement and support from the Chinese government. And the opportunities for people to go back to China and find a job can even be better than the US because there's so many vacant roles to be filled that need these highly educated professionals. So again, the economic driving force is that China is a new untapped market, especially for the pharmaceutical industries. So another incentive for people to go back, right, is because China is developing and encouraging entrepreneurship, and they are actively recruiting the sea turtles to improve and help the Chinese firms move up the value chain in the world trade. So the real and the more tangible icing on the cake is the government support, sponsorship, and tax breaks that are enticing the sea turtles to come back to China. And China has established these science parks, which are essentially incubators and to some degree mini industrial clusters. So of course, people who do want to establish a startup in this kind of setting need to apply for the corresponding regional programs through the government. But once admitted, you will have full government support and help on every step of the way of establishing the startup. So other than the startup funding and tax breaks, some other additional perks would include rent-free offices, manufacturing space and living space for an extended amount of time, and subsidies towards buying your own home near the science parks that you decide to settle in. So all of this is really to help the entrepreneurs hit the ground running the minute they come back from to China.
Got it. So for these entrepreneurs in these biosciences parks, presumably these are very capital intensive industries, pharma, biomedical. How are these companies predominantly funded? Is it entirely through the government? Is it a public-private partnership?
Yeah, so that's a great point, right? Because government funding is an initial incentive for them to go back. But it is actually not the case that these startups are not predominantly funded by the government. But my informants do emphasize that the government funding is for sure extremely important for the initial stages of the startups, pointing to not just the funding, but what I just discussed before, like a physical space for entrepreneurs to work in, to live in, right? It would be so hard for someone to just go back, uproot and go back to a new environment, and take time and trying to find somewhere to live, trying to find somewhere to work. It would take time away from focusing on the R&D of their new startups. Overall, the funding process of these firms are actually still resemble what we will expect for startups anywhere else in the world. You have your angel investors and VCs, but the difference between the sea turtles and the local Chinese founders is that the sea turtles are able to attract investments and from overseas VCs and multinationals, not just from within China, right? So networking is very important for VC, and these sea turtles are bringing home an overseas network, right? Their social capital that they can tap in to fund their startups and firms. They know when and where important global conferences are taking place. They have the global know-how and linguistic skills to win over foreign VCs. So that gives the sea turtles a huge edge. But then on another note, this also indicates that there's a basic challenge of creating a proper venture capital industries within China. And then the current situation is that most investment firms in China are state-owned with politicians as shareholders, and these politicians are more afraid of risks. So many sea turtles do often look west to obtain more funding as needed.
Got it. Coming from investment management, I have to ask, are any of the companies started by sea turtles, run by sea turtles, are any of these companies publicly listed?
Yes, there has been many companies. You would hopefully most people would know some of these: Baidu, Xiaomi, Didi, Ctrip. So these companies are now public, and the Chinese sea turtles are the main drivers of the overseas listings of Chinese companies on the Western financial market. And the Chinese sea turtles, their goal is not just within China, their goal is global, right? And then the US NASDAQ, that stock exchange is their golden standard. They want to be listed on that.
Do we have any sense of whether firms that have sea turtle leadership perform better from a financial perspective?
Well, the fact that most of the listed companies are led by sea turtles shows that the sea turtles do have a performance advantage over the locals. But then, within my field, there has been some limited studies specifically looking at uh, firm performance, and they actually show mixed results. So some studies show that tech ventures founded by sea turtles tend to have higher levels of export intensity and better innovation performance than those founded by locals. But then there are also other studies that show otherwise, that the locals outperform the sea turtles in terms of innovation. And then there's one study that showed that locals also outperform sea turtles on performance dimensions in terms of employment size, sales, profit, survival. But then another study showed that sea turtles' ability to outperform the locals is actually mediated by resource acquisition. And then lastly, there are also studies showing that sea turtle CEOs do indeed outperform local counterparts due to their advanced knowledge and international networks. But then overall, like I'm just listing all these studies, the picture is still very messy, right? And this fear of whether do the sea turtles perform better or do the locals perform better do require more examination. And that's why I want to interview these sea turtles and understand their situation and their experiences back home, and hopefully find out what is driving the differences more than just these correlation studies.
Got it. Got it. That does sound like a fruitful area for future research. Uh, so I had a question about the uh, Trump policies on immigration over the past 4 years, and to some extent they're presumably being unwound slowly. But did those policies on immigration cause an increase in the number of sea turtles?
Oh yeah, so many external factors do contribute to the migration. Well, even before the Trump, back in the 2008, when the U.S. hit one of the worst economic downturn, many people did move back to China for better opportunities. And then in light of recent event you just mentioned, along with the impact of coronavirus pandemic and how the US government have dealt with it, the number of returning students has actually increased 70% in 2020 from 2019. And this trend, I think, will continue for the next few years. Even with the imminent nationwide vaccination, many ethnically Chinese people I talk to, they are still contemplating whether they should return to China or not.
Got it. Got it. Do you have any interesting stories with respect to kind of the more qualitative work? Because I know you've done a lot of interviews. You've kind of looked at things not just from a quantitative perspective, but from a qualitative perspective. Do you have any interesting stories about sea turtles?
Okay, so well, with the pandemic happening right now, I haven't had a chance to go back to China to interview more people. And then there were a few directions I do want to take with my qualitative study, but then I'm right now focusing on one line of research that doesn't really require the Chinese pretext for now. So I'm looking at, so I really want to look at the nature of interaction and collaboration between firms and the government. So this literature, the nature of interaction is between the firms and government is often omitted, or they're investigated mainly through the effects of their policy making. But it really isn't the policies that are guiding my informants. Rather, my informants have told me that it's the government officials, the government auditors who are helping out them in navigating through the whole process. So due to the nature of the work in pharmaceuticals and biomedical devices, government officials, or more specifically, regulators like the FDA, they play an important part in this industry. The auditors play a very important part in protecting the consumers, right? So it's really them, the human actors, who are bridging between the firms and the policies and regulations. So one of the venues I'm looking at is looking at quality control and quality assurance in these newly established firms. And we all know China is actually having a hard time and difficult time with QA and QC in general. And it's somewhat of an understanding that Chinese products are of less quality than the US products. So for example, back in last April, when the pandemic first started, Canada bought around 1 million KN95 masks from China, right? And then after inspection, the Canadian Public Health Authority says that they've all failed to meet the federal standards of use by frontline health professionals. And I mean, this is just one instance of many. I do want to point out the Chinese equivalent of the FDA called NMPA, National Medical Products Administration, is still fairly new compared to their Western counterparts because the industries are fairly new in China. It takes time for changes to take place. It takes time for a specific foolproof pipeline to take place, right? So I'm interested in looking at how the FDA regulators, the FDA auditors, and the pharma firms work together to fully execute the regulations that's supposed to help, that's supposed to protect consumers, right? And then, so right now I'm just interviewing around in the US, the US companies, and then later down the line, when I am able to go back to China, I will want to look at how NMPA regulates the Chinese firms. And I think it will be a very interesting comparable study.
Got it. Thank you. This all sounds super exciting. What more do you hope to find?
I mean, this is all just the tip of the iceberg. And at this initial stage of research, every interview I have, I'm finding out so much more about this whole phenomenon from various angles. But of course, I do hope to go back to China soon and speak to more entrepreneurs to understand how they're faring in these science parks. The science parks are in some sense mini clusters, right? And another Silicon Valley. And we would expect, as the Chinese government also expects when establishing these, that there's some sort of inter-firm collaboration. But then from my initial preliminary results, my informants told me that there's actually not much meaningful interaction going on between the firms for now. But then again, more data is needed. How do these science parks actually operate in comparison to a Silicon Valley model, right? And then, if any of your viewers want to discuss with me additional thoughts and comments or share with me their experiences, they should feel free to reach out to me anytime.
Wonderful. I'll make sure to leave your contact info in the video. Thank you for your time, Carrie. I appreciate that.
Thank you for letting me ramble about my passion.
Right on. All right. Thank you. Bye.